Returning to Moscow, Stalin is greeted by a welcoming committee. He shakes hands with everybody except Yagoda. It is the end of Yagoda's career and his life. Yagoda is relieved and descends the cellar steps. His replacement is Stalin's adoring aide-de-camp Nikolai Yezhov. Yezhov stands 5 feet tall, has the mind of a hyena, and will go down in history as the bloody dwarf. Unlike Yagoda, who could shed tears, Yezhov is pitiless. The widow of Bukharin, one of the party leaders, recalls Yagoda.
From the wife of Prokofiev, who was Yagoda's deputy, I learned that Stalin had ordered Yagoda to torture Kamenev and Zinoviev. Yagoda told this to my husband and burst into tears. Well, Yagoda was different from all the rest of the People's Commissars. He was a party member since 1907, and of course it wasn't because he wanted to make himself a career that he joined the party, but because he was a revolutionary, an idealist. But gradually, under the influence of fear, his character was corrupted.
The new year, 1937, is ushered in with merriment and optimism. The dreaded Yagoda has himself been liquidated. His NKVD successor, Yezhov, appears a harmless, almost comic little man. Stalin begins his year with a top-secret edict, one that will make 1937 a high watermark of terror. Not only does Stalin legalize torture of state enemies, he recommends it. The NKVD gets the news. Now, to work. Leonid Reichman, former NKVD officer.
When our revolutionary brothers were abroad, we knew they were subjected to torture and humiliation. But we took a liberal attitude towards the enemies of Soviet power. We interrogated them with kid gloves. When it was proposed that we resort to methods of physical persuasion against these enemies, we were all dumbfounded. Together with others, I came out and said, "This is something I fail to understand. Perhaps from a political point of view, this is right, but from an operative point of view, this is wrong, because if I hit an arrested person in the face, then I'll never know whether or not he is telling me the truth."
Stalin is indifferent to the truth. He knows that most of his victims are innocent, but he also understands a larger truth, that in order to inspire terror so great as to keep him the undisputed ruler of 200 million Soviets, it is necessary to execute not only the guilty, but the innocent as well. Casting Yezhov as Lord High Executioner is inspired. Stalin sees into his stunted soul. He knows that for the cruel joke played on him by nature, the bloody dwarf will take terrible revenge on the world of other humans. Yezhov turns first on the NKVD. He empties the Lubyanka of the old guard. The Dzerzhinsky and Yagoda men, veterans of the October Revolution, whose loyalties belong to the past, who have no stomach for the new order of official sadism. Down the cellar steps they go. Yezhov replaces them with young party workers, zealots brought up in the certain knowledge that Stalin is infallible. Yezhov looses them on the land. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Mikhailov of the KGB.
The mass reprisals were directed against the kulaks, against the merchants, against the clergy, against all kinds of elements that at that time were considered socially undesirable. And when the social categories had been done away with, they continued on with the nationalities. They began to arrest Germans, Poles, then Latvians, and so on, and whole ethnic populations were put through the grinder.
At this point, Dewey finally realizes that no one was safe, that the Bolsheviks engaged in hysteria in their denunciations, attempted character assassinations of their opponents, and employed a policy of rule or ruin. Dewey came to the conclusion that communists of the Stalinist type harbored a systematic, persistent, and intentional disregard for fair play and an elementary honesty in the representation of facts. The Bolsheviks demonstrated what Lenin had said was true, that the inevitability of class war, the need for violent revolution, party infallibility, and the use of lying and deception to achieve the party's purposes were standard rules of engagement. So this is where it gets really interesting. Dewey goes to Mexico to defend Trotsky against charges that Stalin has made against Trotsky, calling him a traitor. The Dewey Commission is a coalition of liberals and progressives and socialists motivated to expose Stalin's crimes by their love of Trotsky, because they believed that Trotsky's version of communism was better than Stalin's. This was hardly commendable, because Trotsky himself had advocated violence and world revolution and was as militantly atheistic as Stalin, having launched with Lenin the League of the Militant Godless. He had robbed the churches in Russia of all of their treasures and killed many of the priests and the followers. The reports that John Dewey released following his commission was the case of Leon Trotsky and not guilty. This was covered in the New York Times for 3 straight days in December of 1937, and the coverage was favorable to the Commission's conclusions. What's interesting is that the Stalinists worldwide reacted with rage, vilifying Dewey as a warmonger and an enemy of the working people. Dewey's longtime friend and protege, Clarence Lamont, went on the radio immediately after Dewey had finished reading his broadcast statement on the Commission's findings. Lamont attacked the findings and his mentor while simultaneously excusing Stalin that had spearheaded history's most bloodiest regime. And in familiar terms, the New York Times attacked the Hearst press, which was much like Fox News today, and labeled them fascist and reactionary. We're almost at the end. In their typical flair for understatement, the Soviets judged Dewey as the wicked enemy not merely of the American people, but also of all the freedom-loving peoples of the entire earth. Dewey stood in contrast to the freedom-loving men in the Kremlin, who by this point had annihilated anywhere from 20 million to 60 million people. In truth, this was the finest of tributes to Dewey, the mother of all epitaphs. This is by far the most important slide of the whole series. If you take a look at the video that we had played earlier and watch it all the way through, A Monster, a Portrait of Stalin in Blood, you will see how this slide is the culmination of all that we've read and studied up till now. So the Soviets or Stalin turned on Dewey and they hated his guts. You will see that during the Civil War in the Soviet Union, the state took control of millions of children. Remember that John Dewey's work is pedagogy, which is the teaching of children, which the Soviets considered one of the most important things to do while they were fighting the Civil War, the Soviets versus the Bolsheviks. and yet his work was instrumental in building their ideal state. And this is it right here. This is why our schools are producing idiots that don't know basic facts and reasoning, from the Constitution to who their representatives are. They can't use basic reasoning and logic because of this right here. The Hegelian teaching, the pragmatism, all of these code words that John Dewey and other intellectuals use is quoted right here by the Soviets in what they said he did. So they were insulting him, or they were revealing exactly what he was doing to their people and what he ended up doing here. So let's read what they said. They portrayed Dewey as a promoter of obscurantism, to obscure things like the belief in God, muddy the waters in science, muddy the waters in gender, muddy the waters in whatever there is reason, abolish the present state of things. This is what his teaching resulted in. There is no truth. There is moral relativism, which allows you to do all kinds of things to people. They said he was a spreader of vile ideology, a thorough enemy of science, a henchman of the contemporary world of imperialist reaction, and a defender of imperialist barbarism. You're going to see these words, imperialism, in the works of Frank Marshall Davis and all of the communists that we're going to study in other coursework. But I believe that this slide right here wraps it all up together and gives you a good picture of what Dewey's effect was in the Soviet Union and what his effect has been on the American education system. I'd like to give a special shout out to Dr. Paul Kinger. Much of the work that I compiled, the descriptions and quotes that I used were straight out of his book. Any of his books are great books to read. Specifically, this was out of Dupes. The Communist is a great book. The Politically Incorrect Guide to Communism. And there are many others. So I highly recommend that you purchase some of these books. Take a look at them. They are great pieces of work. And he did just a fabulous job. I have learned so much from him. So thank you, Paul. I want to thank you for joining me. I hope this has been informative. Have a wonderful evening.